Can you guys see that all right? I'm not going to guarantee like the fonts are going to be great all through it, but you know, we'll get there somehow. All right. I want to piggyback on what Sam just said. This group is really cool. You can learn a lot from it and things like that. If you are a beginner, there is a huge opportunity for you to step in and help organize things. Okay? You can be like, you know, there when things happen. You can make things happen. You can like have people talk about the stuff you want to talk about, that kind of thing. So I really, really urge you to step up and, you know, fill a space and volunteer. All right. Is that all right? Okay, so a little bit about me. Tamara, this email and my Twitter and my GitHub and that kind of stuff. I have it, this talk is sort of built around an example repo, which is what I use to learn stuff. So you can get the link there. If you want to follow along. Okay. Get this bigger. All right, that's the talk URL, if you're interested in that at all. Not that you have to be. And you'll publish the slides and stuff afterwards, I assume? All right. So just a little bit of history. I've been, for the last about 10 years, working pretty heavily in Ruby on Rails. Do a few other things here and there, and JavaScript in between, and like that kind of thing. What happened? Oh, okay. I started working for a little company end of March. Okay, Reach Local is, well, it's small here in the Twin Cities. It's actually pretty big worldwide. But the local office has about 25 people. Anyone here from Reach Local tonight? Oh, man, I'm going to kill those guys. They said they were coming. Let's go the other way. I was hired on to do this job called an API-driven Rubyist, which is just like, it's a cool job name because it doesn't really mean anything. It goes right alongside my other title called Webologist. Beautiful. So, but the main idea that they wanted me to work on APIs. And since it was a Rails backend, of course, it would have been in Ruby. Yeah. Then sometime in July, I started working as the front end for our standalone React client. The application currently has a regular web part of it, right? And it's usually run through this typical Rails, running through sprockets and all that kind of fun stuff. But they wanted to break away from that, and there were two main reasons. One was they wanted to get an API that was working, and also adopt React and some better practices, because the JavaScript is really like a nightmare, I'll say that. GraphQL was chosen as the API. Does anyone know what GraphQL is? About a third. Okay, I'll go into what GraphQL is during the talk, so you'll see that. And for the Ruby server side, I'm using a gem called GraphQL Ruby, which, you know, it's like we have to make the Rails system talk in GraphQL. Apollo was chosen on the client side to talk to GraphQL. These were not my decisions, these were given. Okay? So this talk is about me learning React and Apollo and GraphQL with the Rails GraphQL API backend all at once. Or this talk is my experiences over about the last few months learning 3 deep technologies when I've been doing something else for like the last 10 years. So that's what it feels like. You see things pounding on top of me and sort of like laying on the bed of Rails and getting smashed all together with that. So I'm going to talk about what GraphQL is. And I'm going to spend a bit of time on what the server-side GraphQL looks like. And then I'm going to spend more time on what the client-side GraphQL is and some other stuff. So what is GraphQL? It's a query language for an API. In particular, it also includes a runtime for fulfilling those queries. It provides a complete and understandable description of the data in your API. And it gives clients the power to ask for exactly what they need. So those weren't my words. Those were the words on the graphql.org website describing what GraphQL is. So it's a language. You basically only ask for what you need, the information you need, when you need it. This is what a GraphQL query looks like. Queries start from a root node. Okay. Does everyone know what a graph is? A data graph? You people? A data graph is basically how data is hooked together in your backend. And it can be cyclical and repetitious and recursive and all those kinds of things. Okay? When you're doing a GraphQL query, you have a root node and you're pulling basically a tree out of that graph of different connections and things like that. You like the sacred dance that goes along with this too, right? Okay, so the root node in the particular case that I'm looking for happens to be a viewer. And this makes sense in a lot of cases because as a client of the web system or web browser or things like that, I'm a user and I am the viewer of the information. Okay, and that's basically lets you determine who is looking at the data. It's used generally to do things like who is authorized, and it also helps with authentication. So then you can say only pull the data that this particular user is authorized to see. And there'll be like changes on the other side. They're only authorized to change these certain things. Queries specify the things that you want to see. Posts in this case, okay? So we want the viewer's posts. Okay? In the post, there's some data that's like the title and the author's name, an excerpt, what date it was published, and how many comments there are. Okay? Yeah. Okay, so as a Rails backend person, you might guess, I decided to start at the backend first. That's what I was most familiar with. It was the least change from where I was going. GraphQL Ruby, it's a gem for basically providing GraphQL processing on the Rails backend. Just exactly what I was looking for. So this is an interesting thing because there's like lots and lots of new terminology for me. Most of you, I assume, are pretty familiar with like REST as an API implementation, okay? This is totally different than REST. There's not very many examples to look at. And most of the examples, tutorials and so on, are written using JavaScript and using Node in the backend to power that. So I had to figure out, okay, so it makes sense here in Node and JavaScript. How do I make it make sense over here in Rails land? And that was fairly interesting. Lots of code reading. Oh, also, if you guys have questions, just pop them out, anytime. So rather than trying to apply this to this legacy application, which I'll go into in a bit, I decided I'm going to write a toy app. How many people were here for my learning styles talk? No one was here. Yeah. A couple people were here. The regulars. Okay, so one of the things I do is when I have stuff to learn, okay, I don't try to like smash it into the product that I'm working on or the project that I'm working on. I carve out a little toy and just make that work. And like then I can play around with it and break it and do all kinds of stuff until I really understand it. And then I can apply that learning to the actual work. And if you look at my GitHub account, you'll see it's littered with those things. This one that I was working on, pardon me, it also includes this authentication, and I'm using JSON web tokens. because this was something that my boss had asked for as a proof of concept. And I got some huge help from the outside. There were other people working from GitHub who basically were friends with some of the people in the project. So it's kind of like, hey, can you come in, give me a little training and give me a little head start and that kind of stuff. So that was really helpful to actually have someone to ask questions of when I needed, and to give just a little bit of examples and stuff like that. Wasn't enough, but it's a good start. But when I had that, it really helped me to understand more. So lots of different moving parts in this thing. The server side, you have to have several things in place before you can sort of like even answer the question that the query is asking. Okay. This is a pretty normal situation for a Rails app. It's not altogether different for like an Express app and things like that. It's just like, okay, so I need to have a database. I need to have some serializers, that kind of stuff. You need a controller, most of all. You need a schema, which defines what the data looks like. You need various queries that you'll answer, and mutations are things which are sort of like, that's how you update data, change data, add data, that kind of stuff. You need to define types. Should be a T, not a D in that. You need things which are called resolvers, which are basically that gather data from various places, chunk it together, and put it back out as a JSON object. And that's really not everything you need. GraphQL is pretty nice. It gives generators. Does anyone here use Yeoman for doing like JavaScript generators? Yeoman? Oh my gosh. You guys are typing everything out by hand? All right. That's another talk. All right. So now this is on the Rails side. So this is Thor generators, not Yeoman generators. But the world of generators is really cool. And basically do some install, which basically gives you the whole sort of setup. It creates your base controller, creates a little schema that you can add to, a root query, which is sort of like what we're talking about, is like, here's the root of your tree. And same thing for a mutation, okay? There's also a whole pile of other generators for doing different kinds of things. The most frequent one I use is the object one, because I'm usually just creating like, here's what an object looks like. But there's things like enumerables, and I won't even go through it. It's just like all kinds of things, interfaces, that stuff. Yeah, there's the whole list. The controller does basically controllers type things. It's the place where we do the authorization, so that the user coming in and looking at stuff, we can say that's a real user, or no, that's not a real user. It marshals the various parameters. So you pass up this query, which is essentially that GraphQL string, but someone has to actually pull it apart and say, oh, okay, this is that, and this is the variables, and this is a thing that plugs in, and that sort of thing. It runs the actual query or mutation, processes whatever the result is, handles errors, and returns basically a JSON object. Okay, now the cool thing about this is that for this sort of application, this is the only controller you need. If your API is exclusively in GraphQL, you have one controller, which is kind of cool. Oops. Keep hitting the turn off the display button. The schema is basically the mouth of your GraphQL system. It defines what the root query is, the root mutation, subscriptions. Subscriptions are things which is like use a WebSocket for it to send down, hey, this changed, boop, do something with it. Notifications and things like that to the client. And then roots. So here we go again. Your data is a graph. You query a tree. Tree needs a starting point, and that is the root. And the best root for a client-facing query is the viewer. Allows for easy authorization. And how's that for foreshadowing? The schema is really very simple. The one that I have defined is basically only has two things in it, just the root mutation and the root query. The way that those are defined are through types. So the query is the stomach. If the schema is the mouth, the query is the stomach. It's actually just a data type. It defines the shape of what your queries look like. Sorry, is there a question? Or, okay, remember, just shout them out. Fields are defined by that relationship. They don't have to be active record, which is a Rails-ish thing. But in the Rails side, that's really the easiest way to do it. Okay? If you're implementing this on a node, for example, you'd probably just use a Mongo or Cassandra or something like that, or you could use Postgres just as easily. You could also hook it up to other APIs, like Google API or something like that. So this is a root query. It can be fairly simple. All right. Since my root query is starting with the viewer, there's only one field, and that field is the viewer. Oops. Okay. And the field also has a type, which is another graph type that we'll define. And then inside that is a function to resolve it, which basically says, I'm going to pass you 3 different things, and I want you to use those 3 different things to bring me back the result. Okay? So for this, in this case, I want to check to see if the context contains the current user, and if it does, I want you to return the current user. That is the viewer. That would be current user as in logged in or signed in or anything like that. There's other things, hand-wavy things that we use to like basically say, how do you know who the current user is? Okay, that's Rails-ish stuff. You do it differently. If it's not, I'm returning this null user thing, which is basically just a null object that doesn't have a name, doesn't have an ID, doesn't have anything. So the DSL that you use to define these things corresponds pretty closely to the GraphQL terminology. It provides for this very descriptive schema exploration so that you can query the API itself to see what's available. You need to specify the types, and it lets you do that. You need to specify resolvers, and it does that as well. Yeah. Okay. Do we need to talk about the null user, or do you guys get what that is? Okay, that was an either-or question, and I see no one nodding or shaking their heads. All right, let's talk about it. Okay. The null user essentially is a user that has, it's an object, okay? And it has the same shape as a user record, but all the fields are either empty or null, okay? And anything that you would want to do, for example, like a user has, they are the author of posts and that kind of stuff. A null user, if you ask it how many posts a null user has, it returns an empty array. You ask it, are you active? It returns false. Those kinds of things. All right. So that the rest of the application can deal with it in a uniform way. We don't have to have anything special about it to differentiate saying no user versus a null user versus an actual user. Okay. So essentially, it's like an anonymous user. So the viewer type. So the viewer is either this logged in user or the anonymous user. This leads to this notion of doing the authorization, okay? Some things in this particular system, for example, anybody coming to it should be able to see all the public published posts, right? Okay. However, someone who is logged in should be able to see all their own posts and all the unpublished posts that they've got, their drafts and that sort of thing, right? They should also be able to create new posts and edit posts and delete posts and that kind of thing. Yeah, okay. So this viewer type is providing this information, all right? There's an ID, which is usually like a UUID object that, 36 character long random string. They have a name. They have their own posts. There's public posts. And then in this particular case, I said all authors because, hey, it's like, hey, who else is on this system kind of thing. I want to see all of Chris's public posts. So in this small system, of course, it doesn't matter because of like, 5 posts at most kind of thing, right? But in a big system, you don't want to return like 1 billion records, right? Pagination is provided for in this library, which is very nice. You can say, okay, if you say, for example, like the one that I'm working on, give me all the jobs for this account, okay? That could be, thousands of jobs, right? Okay. But it gives it to you in a nice thing where it's like, I get 50 at a time, and I ask for the next one, and the next one, and the next one. But, okay, so I'm not doing it in my example. The other types really probably aren't that interesting in here. Okay, so now let's talk about the mutation. Okay? Mutation is the liver of the GraphQL system. It's the thing which is cleaning stuff out. And, that kind of.
Where's this going?
Well, you may ask. Yeah. Okay, and the mutations have a fairly similar structure in terms of how the GraphQL looks. You specify the changing parts, and you specify what you want back after that result. So this is the definition of the root mutation. Okay? And right now, you can see there's only like really 2 mutations, one for creating a new user and one for logging in. Right? The actual application has a few more things like creating a post, editing a post, deleting a post. I haven't got to the comments yet, but we'll get there kind of thing. The fields are the different mutation operations. Okay, let me just pop back here. So you can see that there's this create user and login user. Those are defined as fields. Those are actually separate mutations. This is the way this is defined. Okay, create a new user, log in a user. Okay, I'm just repeating myself. More will come, yeah. Okay, I do have a concern about this. There is a possible explosion of operations, okay? In something like this legacy app that I'm working with, there's on the order of 200 different tables or something like that. And I think, it's sort of like just shifting everything from having, a massive number of controllers and actions over to having a massive number of queries and mutations. So I need to figure out some way to keep that from going absolutely nuts. Haven't got there yet. All right, this is what the create user mutation looks like all by itself. We pass in an argument, and the argument is a set of credentials. And the credentials themselves are another type that I've defined. In this case, it's the name and their email and the password. Right? And then the resolver, I'm handing that off to what's referred to as a plain old Ruby object, or PORO, or Perl. Okay? And that basically takes the same parameters we saw before, the object and the arguments and the context, and then essentially creates the user. Okay. This is that authentication type. And let's see, credentials. There we go. This is the this is the credentials type. So name, email, and password. If you look at, you can see there's an exclamation point in front of the types for email and password. That indicates that those are required fields. So if they came up null, the query would, or the mutation would just basically error out, and you get an error back in your call. Oh, sorry. Okay. The field references this resolver. Okay. It's a Perl, as I said. It's doing the work that you might see in any sort of regular Rails create thing action. Let's pass these three parameters: the object, the set of arguments, and the context. And remember, the context is what holds the current user. Okay. So here we go. I'm doing this call, right? The underscore in front of those parameters means that I'm not actually using those parameters. It sort of indicates something, hinting in terms of like the various tools which say, hey, you didn't use that, liar. Okay. So first I pull off the credentials. And then using those credentials, I create a user record. And then I return, I won't go into OpenStruct. Essentially, basically what it returns is a nifty hash object that you can use in multiple ways. But I'm returning a token and then the user record inside of that. And then if there's anything that goes wrong with the active record create, I basically raise a GraphQL error, which returns a really nice JSON errors object to the client. Then I can process that on the client side and do whatever. You know, say, hey, you were wrong, or whatever. That kind of thing. Okay. I didn't have a chance to rehearse because I couldn't remember everything I was doing. So I just talked through all that. So GraphQL is this discoverable API. That means you can figure out what to call by querying it, which is really nice. There's this thing called the graphiql tool. It's a GraphQL browser. Actually, the people who wrote it call it an IDE, but it's not really an IDE, but it's okay. It comes packaged with this GraphQL Ruby. There's also standalone versions of it. Super useful for debugging. And it's like, did I specify that right? Or did I get that one right? There's also this nice standalone Electron app that you can use. And in case you didn't get, that's graphiql. All right. So that was interesting, right? Rails, no, not so much. Hey, it's 10 years of my life. Okay. I've not gotten as far on the client side yet. And I certainly wasn't as far when I actually created the slides. At work, though, I have written tons and tons and tons of code. And it's like, my usual sort of MO at work is to like remove lots of code before I add lots of code. This hasn't been like that. None of this stuff has existed before. And I am having so much fun at this, really. This is like 3 brand new things for me to learn, plus fitting in something that's also brand new on the back end. I'm just like, I'm in heaven. Learning React. I've been taking React classes and just trying things out for about the last 3 years. Writing little learning samples here and there. Little bit of project exposure, not anything long-term or deep or anything like that. But let me tell you, there is nothing like total immersion in something to learn it. Just like, you have to know it. You have to learn it. You have to walk. Initial obstacles I had, our front-end dev left the project. Just sort of like, hate you guys, I'm going away, kind of. This legacy app is over 10 years old, seriously. I found the first commit on this app, and it was February of 2006. Okay, that was the first commit to GitHub. All right, this thing lived in another repo before that. 21,000 lines of non-vendor and non-compressed, I'm gonna make that clear, JavaScript in this thing, 21,000 lines, okay? Lots of jQuery legacy spread through the app. There's little React Rails components sprinkled in there as well. It used, when I got there, it was using Webpack 1 Rails components inside of Webpack. So right away, we've got 3 different ways of doing JavaScript in this one app. And we were set up to add yet another way of integrating React. Okay. Tests were not passing. the branch that this was being executed on, all this React stuff, was about 6 months old from where it was cracked off of master at that time. And of course, you know, everything else is going along at the same time, right? Was not passing anything. There were no unit tests for JavaScript, none whatsoever. So, you know, where do I start? This had to be incremental. There was no, hey, we're just going to throw everything out and start from scratch, right? Because we actually, I mean, we've got clients, right? They're using the app. They, you know, like they need stuff fixed. They need new features. We need to get stuff done, right? So we decided to take one view out of the Rails app and convert that to a React app. And we took the most common app view. This, just a little background. The application was originally intended and built for this guy's plumbing business and to manage things, estimates and job, work orders, invoices, customers, that kind of thing, right? So the big God object in this thing is called a job, okay? And it's got a whole bunch of other things facing off of that. But we took the job, the view that showed a particular job's details, okay? That's where we are right now. The good news is that I have an existing user interface to model everything off. So I can, you know, I look at the existing user interface and see how that works and that kind of stuff, and then look into the code and see how that works, and then translate it over here to how it would work in React. It's delivered behind a guard, okay, which is kind of cool. We have this thing basically which flips features on and off. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of that kind of thing. People use it for doing like A/B testing. So I'm gonna expose this feature to 10% of my users, okay, and get feedback on it. Well, the rest of the users are still using the old way of doing it or another way. So you can get a comparison, right? We're using this right now to basically do a soft rolling release, okay? Because the thing that I did not want to do, I did not want to replicate that notion of having these super long, month-long branches that are just going further and further and further afield and skipping continuous integration. And I couldn't break anything that already existed, which I think is a good constraint. Okay, extra special fun time stuff, right? No one else on our project, after this front-end dev left, knew anything about any of this stuff. All right, which is cool, right? And another team member who has my heart forever, she took on the role of the React Native developer at the same time because this front-end dev was doing both, okay? And I think that's part of the reason why he left, because he was just disgusted with it all. So she's in exactly the same boat that I am. And we're kind of like sitting in our corner going, what? Okay, so here's the architecture that we came up. We're using Webpack 2, and it's a sort of things that go along with that. React 15, and hopefully it'll be rolling to React 16 imminently. Using React Router 4, very component-based architecture. Using the Apollo client, as I said. Jest and ESLint straight right up front, everything. Just lock it down, do everything. I never have yet on this project created a component without its test right next door to it at the same time. So I want to keep that going. So we have this legacy app with a bunch of stuff bolted onto it. My step one was, let's go back to 0 and slowly start incrementing things that were being added and make sure that CI is green every step of the way. So I created an application layout. This is how Rails delivers things down to the client. Wrote tests, got the continuous integration green. I had to figure out how we were going to deliver the bundles into production, because production assets are stored in a CDN, which is separate from where the Rails app itself lives. Document the hell out of it. This took me really like 3 weeks solid to get all this stuff working. And It was a hard 3 weeks. Okay, we have goals established now. The web client will exclusively use this GraphQL API. I'm not going to go back to any REST stuff or anything like that. And in fact, all the clients, the web, mobile, public API offerings, if we do like an Electron desktop app, all that kind of stuff, they're all going to be on the same footing using this GraphQL API. We intend to offer it publicly. We're going to share components as much as possible. And this web client will not use any of the external existing JavaScript, that 21,000 lines. Okay. If there's something that I need out of that, I'm going to pull it over and move it into the client. How do you organize this stuff? Client's in its own directory right now. So source files in the usual client/source. Reusable components are under components. And then things which are more like focused on a page view or like the job or that kind of stuff is stored under a thing called concerns. There's a source in there too. Client source concerns. Then I got a bunch of things. Man, client source utils. And like I said, tests are right alongside the component objects. And if there's any sort of external CSS and that kind of stuff, that's also right next door to where the component that's using it is. So it kind of looks like this. There's nothing earth-shattering here, I assume. No, please. Am I doing it wrong? Someone put out an article that's something like this says, the absolutely right way to organize your React application. And then sort of the subtitle is, there isn't any. All right, so I'm doing a lot of presentational components, stateless, DOM components, whatever, that kind of thing, low order stuff. And that's working really, really well. There are some pretty obvious shareable components. I'm using some high order component wrappers. The GraphQL itself is a high order component wrapper. But I haven't needed much of it yet. Okay? Basically, sort of an initial query at the top, and then there's a few operations that are mutations and that kind of stuff. Excuse me. Okay, so that's the legacy app. Anyone have any questions about that? I really, really wish I could share it because it's like I am so squiffed by some of the stuff that's going on. It's just like, it's so cool. All right, the learning repo. Okay, I did this one basically. Built the Rails app first, and then used inside that I did create React app and throw it all into the client. So it's essentially a completely separate client within the Rails application structure, folder structure. Added a bunch of libraries. It's just a little bit different than the work one, but not a whole lot. Tried to keep the same concepts going. I don't have jest tests. No, actually, I do now have more jest tests. So. And this, I'm using this to figure things out. Okay. So I work in the play app, figure stuff out, and then implement it in the work app. Yeah, okay. There's not much here. All right. Setting up the Apollo client. All right. This was interesting. First, you have to define a client. Okay. And then you pass that client to what's called a provider. A lot of you, I assume, are familiar with Redux and store providers and things like that. Apollo provider is basically the same thing. Okay. And the Apollo provider has Redux built in under the hood. Okay? But the cool part about this is that, I'm taking a little bit of a side. I'll probably talk about it later. I have slides later. But the cool part about this for me is that I have completely avoided any sort of building of the Redux boilerplate kinds of things or the ceremony. Like I don't have to define actions. I don't have to define reducers. I don't have to define API calls and things like that. It's all done by the Apollo provider. Yes, yes.
Well,
It is a Apollo. The Apollo client is built specifically to talk GraphQL. Okay, and it handles everything that we saw in terms of like talking to the one controller in your API. Okay, and it handles caching. It handles deciding when to actually make a request, and only for the pieces that are actually needed that aren't in the cache or may have changed in the cache. Well, see, I don't know for sure because I started by looking at the tutorials, right? And working through the tutorials that they offer. In terms of like examples and things like that, I have not like actually seen live open source examples so much. Okay, so for those who didn't hear and for the video, it's called React+QL. Okay. Lee Benson, React+QL. Okay. Yeah, the point that Apollo is a React implementation, actually the React part is only one of the three. They offer like 4. Oh, I'm sorry, I missed that. It is a reactive implementation. That's very true, independent of React, because those two things are not the same. But yes, you're absolutely right. It has built in things like observers and the bouncers and all kinds of things. It is a beautiful, beautiful implementation. And I just am enjoying it a lot. Other comments? Okay. Let's see. Okay, so I had to build also a network interface, and that network interface can be used then to like do things like inject your authorization headers and cookies and whatnot, that kind of stuff. So yeah, create the network interface. This is also where you specify the endpoint that you're going to hit. The network middleware, in this particular case, I'm using a token. I'm pulling it out of session storage and sticking it in as an authorization header. I know that's not secure. Don't worry. Okay, and then we use that to create the client, all right? And then that Apollo provider wraps around your application. And it can take a place of the place of your Redux stores that you've been using currently. And like I said, uses it under the hood. And things are going to be even better in version 2. Woohoo! I don't know. Oh, it is released? Oh, version 2 is released. Okay, I haven't seen that yet. Okay, awesome. Okay, so it looks like this, you know, where you might have had your Redux store provider. Now you've got an Apollo provider. And you tell it what client to use, okay? And then the rest of your app just is pretty much like normal. You got your router and your routes, and hey, that's the rest of your app kind of thing. All right, so this was the thing I was experimenting with, how to establish identity. All right, so what comes along first is just an anonymous user comes along and opens the app, and you get this basic query. Okay, sees a list of already published posts. There's have a couple of links, one for signing up and one for logging in. Those two components do mutations. Okay, and then the logged in user gets basically the same query, but this time they're getting more information. They're getting their own posts and that kind of stuff. Creating a user is a sign up path, and there's a sign up JSX component. And it just basically implements a sign up form, and then is wrapped in the GraphQL high order component to perform the mutation. Yeah, so this is what the mutation looks like. Okay. Providing this set of credentials to it, and returning the token and the user's name and email. Okay. Yeah, okay. I don't know how much this stuff is interesting, but essentially I'm creating a form handler that has this mutate function inside of it. Okay, setting change and submit. Okay, so when the user clicks on the submit button, instead of going off and issuing like your standard sort of RESTful post to the server, that kind of thing, inside the submit, I'm calling this mutate function. Okay, passing it in variables. Then I get a response, it returns a promise. I get a response and then do something with that. In this case, what I'm doing is grabbing the token out of the data field, okay, and storing that in the session storage. The render, okay, it's just a form. And then what you do is like all the other kind of higher order component things you do, you basically wrap it with this GraphQL. The sign up mutation inside the GraphQL is the GraphQL statement. And sign up was the component that I'm wrapping. And then export the whole thing. Back in the main, okay, import that and basically just load it up as a routed component. Okay, on the server side, the thing that's receiving this now, again, is our single GraphQL controller. It's getting this create user mutation. And way back in like the first half of the talk, I showed you what that create user resolver did. Okay? It returned the JavaScript token and the user field that was created. Okay? The promise resolves, the token's put into session storage. And then that middleware I showed you that's taking that token out of session storage and sticking it into the authorization header. So now, every time it hits the client, every time it hits the server knows that this is a logged in user. Wow, okay. It's almost 8 o'clock, which is getting really long. Let's see, how much do I have left? I guess just posts. I don't know if that's really that interesting. It's just another sort of thing where it's like I can grab data. Actually, I do want to show something here. Again, it's just another sort of component wrapped in a query. This is what the query looks like, just grabbing public posts and just getting the ID of the post, the title, a little excerpt for it, and when it was published. The component that's getting this information that is being wrapped, okay, essentially what happens is it gets passed in this object that starts at the root of that with that data. And there's 3 possible keys. One is the loading, another is an error possibility, and another one is data name. And so the component basically plays off each of those. If loading is still true, then I'm just going to return this little thing that just says, hey, loading, okay? If there's an error, I'll return the thing that says, oh, error, world warning, okay? But if the data is there, then I'm going to go ahead and do something with it. I just talked about this. Now, the data name is interesting because what is actually returned is the root of that query you passed up. So who remembers the root of the query that I passed up? I'm testing y'all. What's the root of the query? Viewer! Okay, so that's the query. Remember viewer? All right. The data JSON object that's coming back looks almost exactly like that query. So then I'm just rendering the lists. I pass it in and say, hey, I'm going to map through all these posts, and I'm going to show something. Again, at the bottom, we wrap it all together with that GraphQL. All right, should I learn? Like, holy crap. I didn't have time to write down stuff. So I've been trying to keep stuff on my dev blog. You know, today I learned about this in GraphQL. So, but I still have like a whole lot of things to write. What's next? What's next for me is still working deeply in this application, this legacy app. I'm learning new stuff every single day. It's just that rich of things to do. Right? So thank you. That's it. Please ask questions. Yes, Sam. Thank you. That one?
I've been using GraphQL, but not with Apollo, so we're not following this.
Sure.
That GraphQL and wrapping your components is coming from the Apollo library.
Well, this is a standard way of doing high-order component wrapping. Okay. So like you can use, like if you use, let's just take GraphQL out of the equation completely. If you use like recompose, you like with props and that kind of stuff, it'd be the same sort of thing.
So this GraphQL function, is that coming from Apollo?
That is coming from Apollo.
This is enriching your components with Apollo stuff.
Yes.
This actually isn't coming directly from GraphQL. It's kind of, it's a layer on top of that.
Yeah.
Do we import GraphQL from
Yeah, indeed.
Apollo client?
Indeed, yeah. Yeah, React+Apollo. Yeah. Yes, it is specifically the Apollo client's version of the GraphQL high-order component, which delivers essentially props of data into the wrapped component.
So basically, like how I'm understanding it is this Apollo client allows you to skip over what it does, and then you just write your GraphQL queries, and it wraps those, takes care of sending off the requests, and bringing the data back.
Yep. Yes.
Kind of fulfilling a couple of different.
Yeah. In addition, the Apollo client is also building this gigantic cache and store. Yes, right. And handling things like, oh, that thing changed, therefore I need to make a new request, sort of thing too. Or, you know, oh, I deleted, this is what I did, this is the thing I learned yesterday. It's like, I deleted the job, okay? And it automatically went through and like deleted the job and rerouted to the appropriate place, and I didn't have to do a damn thing, which was so freaking cool. You know, because normally you have to like, you know, send your stuff up to the Redux store and make sure it's getting to all the different components the right way and stuff like that, right? This is like, I had no work to do. Other questions? Yeah, just to reiterate for the microphones and stuff, it's like they've rewritten the caching engine so you can check and select which caching algorithms you want. And also the polling stuff is completely new too, as I remember hearing too. Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the website is apollodata.com. All right. Is that it? I'm actually leaving tomorrow night. There's the GraphQL conference in San Francisco I'm going to, so that's going to be amazing.
Report back.
I will report back. Yeah. I couldn't tell you. I couldn't tell you. It's sold out? They're still advertising. Oh my gosh. It's like, you know, like, here's one on my Facebook feed. Here's another one on my Facebook feed. Here's another one on my Facebook feed. It's like, I'm going already. Stop asking. That's probably it. Yeah. My history is like full of that kind of stuff.
Well,
That's it for me.